America at war. Tonight, the capital of chaos. A suicide bomber in Baghdad attacks U.S. Marines. Looting spreads wildly out of control. Lara Logan has exclusive details of the new terror war. Danger on the road to Baghdad. Dan Rather is just miles from the capital and has a first-hand account tonight of a harrowing journey. Coming of age in a war zone. Byron Pitts with the story of war turning boys into men. And while their husbands fight, Mika Brzezinski reports on 3 wives brought together by war, tragedy, and hope.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Tonight, continuing coverage of America at War.
Good evening. I'm Harry Smith. You'll hear from Dan shortly. He's on the road to Baghdad. One day after the capital fell, it remains a very dangerous place. The Saddam regime is no longer in charge, but no one else is either. U.S. forces are still battling Saddam loyalists and taking more casualties. Looters own many of the streets of Baghdad and anything else they can get their hands on. Some streets are covered with the dead of a war that is still not won. CBS News has correspondents in key positions in and around Baghdad. We begin with Lara Logan and a suicide bombing that left at least 4 U.S. Marines wounded.
The suicide attacker struck at around 6 o'clock this evening. A man walked up to a Marine checkpoint and detonated explosives which were attached to his body. It's not the first suicide bombing of the war, but it is the first attack of this kind in the capital. This is how dangerous the streets of Baghdad are right now. A car comes too close to U.S. Marines. When it fails to pull back, they open fire. The threat of suicide bombers has made U.S. forces wary of everyone and raised security levels. At checkpoints throughout the city, Iraqi civilians are kept at bay until soldiers have made sure they're not wearing suicide vests packed with explosives. A U.S. Marine source tells CBS News that around 50 of these vests were found in a school in Baghdad today. These troops from the 3rd Infantry Division fought in one of the most intense battles for Baghdad, coming under fire for 72 hours straight from Iraqi Republican Guard and Syrian volunteer fighters. Did they put up a good fight?
Yes, but no fight too big for the U.S.
But it was not only soldiers that died here. This is Baghdad's main airport road, now turned into a highway of death, littered with the bodies of those who fought against the Americans and civilians caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time. With the battle won, they're now trying to win hearts and minds. But they may have to become Iraq's policemen. The city is rapidly descending into chaos. Even hospitals were being looted tonight. Any building associated with Saddam's regime has been ransacked. Here it got personal, at the home of the Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz. His fondness for cigars and fine wine were well known, something this Iraqi thought he'd try. U.S. Marines were reluctant to get involved, but they stepped in when a vengeful crowd turned on this man, accusing him of being an informant.
Kill you! Kill this man!
It's not the role they wanted, but it's one they may have to take on to prevent all-out anarchy. In the words of one Marine commander, it's turning into the Wild West out there. Lara Logan, CBS News, Baghdad.
U.S. forces holding the center of the capital today set about trying to secure the rest of the sprawling city. It is a big job and dangerous, but it is a vital job, and correspondent John Roberts learned firsthand today how the U.S. Marines are getting it done.
The open defiance of Saddam Hussein spread from the city center all the way to the gates of Baghdad today. People who were still wary of retribution now believe Saddam is gone for good.
Saddam, good. Let it go.
And just to drive the point home, Marines today moved into the former headquarters of Saddam's dreaded secret police.
It's like being in Berlin in 1945.
This was Saddam's fear factory, the Mukhabarat, where thousands of Iraqis went in and many never came out. The secret police badges are now nothing more than souvenirs. A statue of their great leader now in pieces on the floor.
Humpty Dumpty, I don't think so. There are no Kingsmen. This is not getting put back together.
But in other areas of Baghdad, like Saddam's sports club, Marines remain on guard against another foe, the Fedayeen and foreign fighters who still snipe at Americans. These are the neighborhoods that the U.S. Marines have been working so hard to clear. One moment they can be quiet and friendly. The next they erupt in the fury of AK-47 and rocket-propelled grenade fire. The Marine strategy has been to push the resistance back all the way to the Tigris River, where it has nowhere to hide. That resistance, Marines predicted, would be crushed within hours. But there is no stopping the rampant looting in Baghdad. The UN compound where weapons inspectors lived is the latest target. Iraqis, who it appears will now steal anything not nailed down, took everything from computers to 4x4s. The U.S. military still turns a blind eye to such acts, even aids in the ridicule of Saddam Hussein. But with lawlessness threatening to break out in full flame, they can't ignore it for long. John Roberts, CBS News, with the Marines in Baghdad.
Dan Rather is in a caravan of journalists heading to Baghdad. A short time ago, he filed this report via videophone from a very dangerous stretch of road.
We're on the near outskirts of Baghdad with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division. There's a half moon up there and the stars, but they're obscured to some extent by that cloud of black smoke you may see over my shoulders. This comes from the oil trenches set afire by the Iraqis. Things are tense, as you would imagine, to say the least. U.S. intelligence tells us that the road that we traveled to get to this location just outside Baghdad, we drove from the Jordanian border in here, partly in daylight, partly at night. But U.S. intelligence agents tell us that the road is covered from time to time with meandering and wandering Iraqis who are looking for trouble, looking to kill U.S. soldiers if they can, and who have orders to kill any Americans, soldiers or otherwise. We saw on 3 occasions pickup trucks loaded with people with guns. On one instance, it was a police car with its lights going, tried to flag down our caravan as we made our way around an obstacle course on the highway. We speeded up and got away. Just a few minutes ago, another situation developed. 2 Iraqi trucks came racing down the road just behind me. The U.S. Army soldiers saw them barreling toward them. They opened fire. Everybody ducked for cover. Nobody knew what the situation was going to be. The trucks hastily turned around and sped away. Who was in them, what their intentions might have been, no one knows. But in the dark, of course, the U.S. troops weren't taking any chances. It's typical of the guerrilla tactics that are being developed in one area after another here around Baghdad, and an indication that it'll take a while, perhaps a long while, before the fighting stops in Iraq. Dan Rather, CBS News with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division just west of Baghdad.
Now for an overview of the war. At the Pentagon, CBS News national security correspondent David Martin has tonight's big picture.
Marines rolled up to a Baghdad mosque where local residents said Saddam Hussein might be meeting with his top aides. A firefight broke out. A Marine was killed. Children were wounded. But Saddam is still unaccounted for, and the war goes on. Armored vehicles loaded aboard transport planes in Germany come rolling down the ramp ready for combat in northern Iraq as the U.S. and its Kurdish allies push toward Saddam's hometown of Tikrit. Remnants of Saddam's regime have already pulled out of Kirkuk and are rapidly abandoning Mosul, 2 of the North's key cities. That should clear the way for seizing the northern oil fields, if the Iraqis don't sabotage them first. If the weapons caches being uncovered in the south are any indication of what is stored in the north, the Iraqi forces don't lack for ammunition. But after 3 weeks of airstrikes and commando raids, they have very little combat power left. Tikrit is likely to become the final fortress of Saddam's regime. A sprawling complex of palaces, barracks, and command centers, it has already been heavily bombed. But U.S. intelligence believes as many as 10,000 die-hard fighters could be holed up there, supported by a civilian population still loyal to Saddam. Even with the reinforcements, the U.S. only has about 5,000 troops in the north, so the Army will probably send tank units from around Baghdad north to Tikrit and attack from 2 directions. And there is one other fortress, the town of Al-Qayyam on the Syrian border, an area Saddam used to launch Scud missiles against Israel in the first Gulf War. Iraqi forces there have been battling fiercely, and American officials think it's because they are protecting something of great value, perhaps missiles with chemical or biological warheads. Elsewhere in Iraq, Marines came across a truck with a false panel which they thought might be a mobile biological weapons lab.
Special teams have now searched about a dozen suspected chemical and biological weapons sites and have sent samples back to the U.S. for analysis. But still no hard evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Harry?
David Martin at the Pentagon, thanks. In northern Iraq tonight, U.S. Special Forces and allied Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga, are preparing to move against the city of Mosul, and they're hoping for a repeat of today's nearly bloodless liberation of Kirkuk, the other major city in the oil-rich region. Correspondent Alan Pizzi is there.
The fall of Kirkuk began with airstrikes called in by U.S. Special Forces, one of them close enough to be a friendly fire near miss. Then a convoy of Americans and Kurdish Peshmerga guerrillas headed on to liberate the city that sits on 10 billion barrels of known oil reserves, pausing only to accept the surrender of a few Iraqi soldiers. Just inside the city limits, the Americans acknowledged praise for President Bush, took a bow, and it became an all-Kurdish show. There was no doubting this was liberation that had long been awaited.
We are free today. I want to speak. Thanks, Mr. Bush.
The entire city seemed to be on the streets, cheering, gleefully bashing a fallen statue of Saddam Hussein. Local residents said the Peshmerga only had to fire over the heads of Iraqi troops.
There was meaning run away,
and
survive.
And what did the Iraqis do?
They were throwing their weapons and running away.
While the Peshmerga were being conquering heroes, looters tore apart a soft drink company owned by a member of Saddam's Ba'ath Party. A couple of hours later, the Special Forces showed up to secure the building.
As joyful as this is for the Kurds, it may not prove to be quite the same for Washington. The Turkish foreign minister says Secretary of State Colin Powell has promised that U.S. troops will replace Peshmerga guerrilla fighters here. On evidence so far, that won't be easy.
The Turks will send in military observers and are threatening to send troops if the Peshmerga don't leave town, which could spark a mini war instead of celebrations. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Kirkuk.
Iraqis lucky enough to have electricity today saw a new TV station take the air with a couple of well-known names. President Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair anchored what's called Toward Freedom TV, broadcast from a U.S. military aircraft. Mr. Bush promised U.S. forces will help Iraq build a peaceful and representative government, then leave. Here in New York City, thousands of trade union workers and firefighters rallied at Ground Zero in support of American troops fighting in Iraq. Speakers and many in the crowd see the war in Iraq as part of the war on terror, which began after the attack on the World Trade Center, September 11, 2001. Ahead on the CBS Evening News, they're U.S. Marines, but they're also teenagers who have been growing up fast. Byron Pitts has their story next. When the U.S. Marine Corps says it's looking for a few good men, it means a few good young men who can handle the risks and rigors of combat. And as correspondent Byron Pitts reports, many of the Marines on the front lines in Iraq are very young, but growing up fast.
From a distance and the comfort of a couch, these Marines may look like men, leathernecks of generations past. But sit in a cramped, musty armored vehicle with 20 privates and corporals, the backbone of the Corps, and you'll soon discover these Marines are boys.
Who's the youngest? Right here. You're the youngest? How old are you? 19.
These are the Marines of Lima Company, 2nd Squad. Average age, 19.
These guys are more than ready. They've been training for a long time.
A year ago, most of these hands held school books. In the past 3 weeks, bitten by bugs and hardened by battle, these hands have pulled triggers that took lives.
You can't have any time for any kind of fear, any kind of anything to hesitate, because then people start dying, and then that'll be something you have to live with forever.
When a bullet flies over your head, forever no longer seems so long. And in what other world of multi-million-dollar machines is the boss 22 years old?
Our objective, we have 3 objectives where we need to go.
In Squad 2, 22-year-old Corporal Nick Potterick from San Diego, California, is the boss. When he speaks, the others listen.
Hey, tell them to turn off the air.
Their lives in his hands.
It's a lot of responsibility for a 22-year-old.
Yeah, bringing a bunch of 19-year-olds home puts a lot of weight on your shoulders. So it's all right. That's what I signed up for.
Corporal Potterick says the first thing he wants to do when he gets home is take his mom and 2 younger sisters out to dinner. Before Baghdad, he says, I never thought that way.
For all of Squad 2, life has changed in these past few weeks. Boys read about history. Men make it. Byron Pitts, CBS News, Baghdad.
Arlington National Cemetery, where so many heroes of America's wars are buried, is now the final resting place for a hero of the Iraq War. Captain Russell Ripto, a U.S. Army Ranger, was laid to rest today, 1 week after he was killed by a suicide car bomber. Ripto, 27 years old, grew up in Nebraska and later moved to Denver. An Army chaplain told mourners Russell loved his troops, and they loved him. The worldwide death toll from the respiratory disease known as SARS has grown to at least 111. The Centers for Disease Control today reported 166 cases in this country, but no deaths so far. A diagnostic test for SARS is expected to be available within 3 weeks. In hard-hit Hong Kong, 3 more SARS deaths were reported today. Officials say the healthcare system there is near collapse, and they warn that anyone living with a confirmed SARS patient will be quarantined for up to 10 days. And if you ever wanted to treat yourself to a flight on the supersonic Concorde, now's the time. British Airways and Air France are grounding the planes for good later this year. They blame a weak economy and rising costs. By the way, a round-trip ticket cost about $11,000. On the CBS Market Watch, after 2 days of losses, stock prices managed a modest rally. The Dow closed up 23 points. The Nasdaq gained about 9. You're watching the CBS Evening News, and up next, the home front, waiting and worrying, supporting one another, hoping for the best, fearing the worst. It's a story as old as war itself. When husbands, or in these days, wives, march off to fight, spouses remain behind, trying not to worry, but worrying just the same. And like troops on the battlefield, they rely on one another for support. Mika Brzezinski found one example of just that kind of bonding at Hunter Army Airfield in Georgia.
So cute. For Denise Gonzalez, the timing of this pregnancy couldn't be worse.
I can't imagine having this child without him.
But while her husband Martin fights in Iraq, she is in good hands. Megan Adamowski and Jennifer Veal-Diaz make sure of that. Hardly a move is made without one of these friends close by.
There is a closeness here that I don't think I could ever come close to.
You'll never find a closeness as you do being a military family.
With their husbands deployed in the same helicopter unit, shared sacrifice bonds these women together.
I didn't want to marry a soldier. Is that harder now? Yes, every day.
Last week, when news came of a downed Black Hawk, the women raced to be together and wait. 6 from their husband's unit were killed, but no one knew who.
I cannot even describe to you what those hours were like. Sheer panic.
Each woman knew that good news for one could mean devastating loss for another.
You were worried it was her husband?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it wasn't mine.
But it was Megan's husband. 29-year-old Captain Jimmy Adamowski was remembered along with 5 other fallen soldiers this week in Savannah, where the couple married just 7 months ago.
I had a much more
fulfilling marriage and the short few months we had together than most people will ever have in their lives.
Out of this loss comes a bond that will last for life.
I know that in 10 years, if I come up crying, that they'll do anything they can to be by my side.
Just as she will be for Denise, due to give birth to a boy in 2 weeks.
I cannot wait to hold him. There might be another person in this world that would be as special as Jimmy.
And together, they will wait for him, too. Mika Brzezinski, CBS News, Savannah, Georgia.
That's the CBS Evening News. For Dan Rather in Iraq, I'm Harry Smith in New York. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you in the morning on The Early Show. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, log on to cbsnews.com. America at War. Dan Rather reports from the war zone tomorrow. Experience CBS News.